Julian Kintobor of the House Ivo is arguably one of Sonic's most recognizable rivals. Oh, wait, hold on. You're saying that you don't recognize that person with a weird name? Well, you might actually know him better as Dr. Ivo Robotnik, who would later become Doctor Eggman. We're going to be taking a look at this character from his beginning as Julian all the way up to his final phase where he first became a more recognizable Eggman in the Archie Sonic Comics. And of course, like most things in Archie Sonic, it gets way more confusing than it should be, so let's get this thing started. We're going to start by taking a step back into the past, a past where humans, which were called Overlanders, still existed in large populations on the planet, and one such human named Paladin would meet the then Prince Emerson. Oh, also, Paladin has a gun. Holy moly, the story is starting off the rails. So Paladin shoots his gun with Emerson, and the two of them are overall getting along, until of course Paladin decides that he's going to shoot a bird because he's an absolute psychopath with the ugliest haircut known to man. Of course, Emerson would jump in the way and he would get shot instead, which would then spark what would be known as the Great War between animals and humans. Now with that context, we can fast forward just a little bit to Julian. Julian was a scientist who studied under another human scientist by the name of Nate Morgan. Nate would take Julian under his wing, and once Julian felt that he had learned all that he could from Nate, he would then sabotage one of his experiments, which would then lead to Julian gaining full control over Nate's lab, while Nate dealt with the weird legal system that this world had, which would ultimately oust him out of the city. Julian wouldn't be in charge of this lab for long though, as he'd pretty quickly himself be chased out of town by guards who are attempting to kill him. Why did this happen? Well, Julian built a weapon called the Ultimate Annihilator and wanted to test it on his fellow Overlanders. Whoops, I guess he wasn't a good choice to put in charge after all. Let's hope he's never put in charge again of anything. That's foreshadowing. Julian would, through happenstance, lose these guards by falling face first into a swamp and suffocating. Of course, this isn't the end of Julian's story, and luckily Julian would be found by two hedgehogs. And quick pause for a bit of contention I have with this, but I absolutely hate it when they just add a tuft of hair on top of what is essentially Sonic or something and instead just call it a new character. This hedgehog is Jules, and the one with the mustache is Charles. Jules is actually Sonic's dad, while Charles is Sonic's Uncle Chuck, which is pretty cool to see them in the past. Jules and Charles would rescue Julian and bring them to their king. While meeting their king Max, Julian would explain that his people, humans, are weak to being attacked, and that might be single-handedly one of the worst pieces of advice I've ever heard. But apparently, this piece of advice is so crucial and so good that it's good enough for the king to make Julian the leader of the Mobian's army. Like, what? As the leader of the Mobian military, Julian would be approached by a lion warlord named Kodos, who would propose an alliance to rule the kingdom together, thanks to all kinds of amazing inventions that he had possessed, like a mace, a stick with a ball on it, like that kind of mace. Oh, and also, Kodos has this secret portal that leads to the Zone of Silence, which is almost never touched upon in the comics, and it's basically just a banishment area like the Shadow Realm in Yu-Gi-Oh!, except the Zone of Silence is also where Chaos Emeralds like to hang out sometimes. Well, that's all Julian needed to be shown, so he bonked Kodos on the head with this newfound mace and threw him into the portal. I have absolutely no idea what Kodos' plan was. Like, was he planning on just individually leading every single person into this portal and then yeeting them into the zone? Like, the portal doesn't seem portable, and he doesn't really seem to have an amazing cache of goodies if the first cool one he shows off is a mace. So like, I don't get what his thought process was here. Following this, Julian would use Kodos' attempt to betray the king in order to convince Max to destroy every human in their path. Because a lion tried to overthrow the king. That's literally it. This guy is not qualified to rule a kingdom because after hearing this, he just up and agrees with Julian. War from here, unsurprisingly, would just go from bad to worse. The Mobian kingdom would be faced with bombardments from the people, and to make matters worse, Sonic's dad Jules would get shot while on a mission, and the team would have to rush away with Jules in critical condition. Now, believe it or not, Sonic's dad getting shot is actually vital to the state of Sonic's world in the present day, and if he had not been shot, things might have actually gone differently. With Sonic's dad in critical condition, Charles would propose something risky, a unique apparatus that he had invented in order to aid the medical world, a device that would be later known as the very first roboticizer. This might have actually saved Jules' life, if not for the fact that Julian, much like he did with Nate, sabotaged this device, which could have saved someone's life. Instead, after Charles placed his brother in the machine, Jules would emerge as a mindless robotic zombie, with seemingly no free will of his own. Meanwhile, during this time, King King Max would be fighting an Overlander, and upon winning, he would spare his life in exchange for the end of the war. This would be a big moment because it meant that this great war was finally over, and that Julian's rise to power would hopefully also be over. Luckily though, for Julian and unfortunate for the rest of the world, Charles, stricken with grief over the fact that he just turned his brother into this mindless zombie, and dealing with some major imposter syndrome, would flee, but not before giving the roboticizer to Julian in hopes that he could do more with it as a scientist than Charles could. Charles, however, would not be able to flee from his problems, as pretty shortly after, Bernie, Sonic's mom, would learn that her husband was now a mindless slave to Julian and had to obey his every command. And not only that, but Julian would force her husband to throw her into the roboticizer that would give her a pair of robot boobs for some reason. Eventually, they would regain their senses, but for the time being, they would be trapped as Julian's slaves, and Sonic would be left in the care of his uncle, whom he would then know as Uncle Chuck. With this, all the pieces were in play. Sure, the battle known as the Great War was over, but the real war had only just begun. Julian would be accepted in Mobian society as the Minister of Science, instead of their military leader, and he would be ordered by King Max to dismantle the military. But uh-oh, are those sneaky little crossed fingers I see behind Julian? Yeah, unsurprisingly, the guy who has a track record of sabotaging people up until this date would go on to sabotage King Max. Who would have guessed? He'd use his robot army to usurp the king, and it's here that we would finally meet Robotnik, as Julian would claim that he was no more from here on out. It took me almost 7 minutes to establish Robotnik's past, and that's how you know that this is early Archie Sonic, because holy moly, if this isn't one of the most convolutedly long backstories to establish who Robotnik is. We haven't even gotten to the point where he becomes Eggman yet. I just wish this was kind of tightened up, but also I kind of love this. With Robotnik now in charge, he would capture these Mobians he once helped and would force them into the roboticizer in order to create his new world order where Mobians were nothing more than robotic slaves to the Mad Doctor's heinous plans for the world. There's actually a fun little thing here where he talks about how, from his point of view, the Mobians must be eliminated, and if we were to just rewind a little bit, we'd actually see that there's a point where Robotnik, which was then at that point Julian, explained to King Max that the humans wouldn't stop until they eradicated every single being that wasn't a human. So maybe that was a bit of his own personal opinion seeping through, or maybe I'm reading just a little bit too into the Sonic comic book, because these comics are all out of order. Like, this comic issue is issue number 43, but the one where he's talking to King Max about the human and eradicating and all that is issue number 74, so there is a little bit of a gap there. Now that we know how Robotnik came into being, let's work towards how Eggman came into being, because right now we only really have one small fraction of this story. Robotnik would wage war on the Mobians, and even before Sonic's Freedom Fighters, there would be another group with some ridiculous names that I don't even want to read, because not only are they dumb, but they also just seem kind of nonsensical without even trying to be funny or anything. Although maybe they had forgettable names because they just wouldn't last all that long. While on a mission to stop Robotnik, they would be betrayed by one of their own, a snake with arms, which is really more of a half lizard or maybe a half snake in this scenario. But Robotnik would double-cross the double-crosser snake, and he would transform the entire OG Freedom Fighters into robotic slaves thanks to his first ever room-sized roboticizer. As we've seen before, Robotnik would be in a constant state of trying to beat the last of the Mobian resistance. But if I were to tell you that Eggman, who first showed up with his in-game appearance in issue number 75, has nothing to do with basically any single of these early on fights between Robotnik and the Mobians, and instead has roots in issue number 19, would you believe me? Well, you better believe me, because we're going to rewind all the way into issue 19, where we would first see the entity that would later become the Eggman in Sonic's universe. In this story, Sonic gets a visit from other Sonics from across the Sonic multiverse, and they need to go up against an even more evil version of Robotnik called Robo-Robotnik. It's Robotnik, but he's weirdly dark blue, and that's kind of it, really. Eventually, this would culminate in a giant Robo-Robotnik suit fighting all the Sonics that ultimately is defeated by a bunch of Sonic balls. I have been up for 17 hours straight, writing and reading these Sonic comics, and Sonic Balls is what came to me instead of Spin Dash. I don't actually want to change it because I think Sonic Balls sounds a heck of a lot funnier. So, head writer at the time, Ken Penders, would become weirdly obsessed with Robo-Robotnik, and he would regularly show up after his introduction in issue number 19. We'd go on to learn that he had a very similar life to Robotnik in the universe that we know, except during his final fight with Sonic, he would undergo roboticization on himself, and after his spat with all of the Sonics, he would upload his consciousness into a satellite in the main Sonic's universe, and he would actually end up communicating with the main Sonic's universe's Robotnik to ask him to give him a hand to help reconstruct himself. At a later point, Sonic is framed and arrested for the murder of Princess Sally. Her murder was greatly exaggerated, but that's a whole other thing, and Sonic wouldn't be locked up for long as he would pretty quickly escape his confinement. In reality, a wolf named Drago, who was working for Robotnik, orchestrated all of this, and you might be wondering how he did it, so listen, just get ready, because you have to really suspend some disbelief for this story. Drago would get his girlfriend Hershey to wear a Sonic costume, but Hershey isn't evil, and it would only be while wearing this Sonic mask that she would realize that the eyes in the suit make everybody look like Eggman's nephew Snively. So Hershey attempted to kill the princess while in this goofy costume because she thought that the princess was actually Snively. Of course, with the kingdom in a frantic state without Sonic, Robotnik would swoop in and then try to take over. Also, Robotnik has the most phallic robot I've ever seen. Like, you can't tell me that the artist drew this and didn't think about the fact that he gave this crocodile a giant robot tank wang here. So Robotnik has his Annihilator and is planning on using it on all of the Mobians. Of course, Sonic would then rush in and try to stop the Doctor. He'd have to fight through Robotnik's defenses as well as Snively to get there, but finally, he would arrive, and in an all-out fight, the two would begin to duke it out. During this fight, we'd learn that the Annihilator was tampered with. It was actually tampered with by Robotnik's own nephew Snively, who would set it to only target his uncle so that he could take over, because I mean, one saboteur would only raise, of course, another saboteur. Sonic and Robotnik would continue their fight without the knowledge of what Snively had done, and instead would believe that the war room they were in would blow up shortly. There are some really fun fight scenes here, actually, if I'm being honest, and for all the complaints I might have, I do think this is overall a pretty cool moment in the comic. The fight would ultimately culminate with Robotnik getting effectively erased on the atomic level. This means that Robotnik is dead, and like, he's gone. I mean, not totally gone because this is a comic book and just a little bit of foreshadowing for the future, but this exact Robotnik might come back later. We'll see. Put a pin in it. But overall, this is a pretty big win considering the amount of damage that Robotnik had caused throughout his life. Like, this Robotnik is truly quite evil. He's gone behind everybody's back who has ever helped him. So what happened to Snively? Well, he would end up with a mystery figure in space with a number of doomsday satellites set up and primed on Mobius. Meanwhile on Mobius, Sonic would find that his parents have gone missing and would soon come to the realization that they were kidnapped, or parent-napped? It's here that we would learn that Robotnik is back, and Robotnik is now in space. Sonic would waste no time building a team to go into space with the help of a dragon who would pull their spaceship through the atmosphere. None of those words would have ever escaped my mouth if I didn't make this YouTube channel. They have no reason to be written in a sentence, and yet here we are. Thank you, Archie Sonic. In space, they would find a bulbous satellite, and once they entered and fought their way through some defenses, they would come face to face with him once again. This time though, Sonic would hold no punches, and after a fight that really shows how strong Sonic might be, Robotnik is knocked towards some acid in a very Terminator-like moment. This would reveal that Robotnik hasn't actually come back, and instead, this right here is Robo-Robotnik that we had met before, who has been masquerading as the Prime Universe's Robotnik. This new yet similar enemy would have Sonic's parents as his mindless slaves and bait to pull Sonic in. It would be at this moment that everybody on board, including Snively, would be against this more monstrous Robotnik, and they would manage to rig the satellite to blow up. But they wouldn't have much time, and thanks to a warp ring that Sonic just conveniently had, Sonic was able to rush Robo-Robotnik and save his parents in order to escape with them and get off of the satellite with his friends before it blew up. But this wouldn't be the end of Robo-Robotnik. In fact, this would be the beginning of a new chapter, the chapter that we can call Eggman. Robo-Robotnik may have lost his body, but his mind was already backed up by many other clones with the design of modern Eggman that we would see in the video games, and the Eggman that we would know for actually the majority of the Archie Sonic comics. And that is where we are going to call it for now. We have covered a lot in this video, and I mean like a lot of information. We looked at Julian all the way to the somehow separate yet kind of same character that is Eggman, and I'm gonna be honest here, this is one of the biggest projects I've undertaken. There is so much to go over with this guy, so stay tuned and subscribe if you haven't already. If you enjoyed this video, I would greatly appreciate it. Feel free to leave any comments if you feel like I missed anything or there's anything that you would like to add. I always enjoy reading that. At the end of the day, I hope you enjoy what you saw, and I just hope that ultimately you have a good one.